Welcome back to the Australian First Responder Foundation interview series. My name is Wade Norrie and I'm the chair of the board of the AFRF. Today is the last of our interviews in this year's series. I think you'll find it interesting and enlightening, where Marianne McLeod talks with Erin Smith, an Australian academic and first responder herself. Erin has become well known in Australia as a leader and an expert in her research and recommendations in regards to mental health and well-being of first responders. She's internationally known and peer-reviewed and known for her work with the post 9/11 in the disaster response of first responders. And most recently, her publications are in relation to the bushfires of the summer of 2019-2020, and this, in particular the south coast of New South Wales and Victoria. I think Erin will bring to the conversation some new and interesting statistics and recommendations that I think we will all find useful and beneficial. I'd like to thank everyone for participating and watching our series this year. I hope you found them useful. We hope to be able to provide other discussions and interviews next year. We hope that you and your families have a safe and happy festive season. And from the Australian First Responder Foundation, have a very happy new year. Thank you.
Welcome to this podcast of the Australian First Responder Foundation, and it's so nice to have Erin with us today, Erin Smith. Erin, I understand that you are an associate professor in disaster and emergency response, which sounds very intriguing, and I'm excited to hear more about that. But particularly, I'm interested in how then you became passionate about supporting the mental health of first responders.
Thanks, Marie. It's wonderful to be with you. And I think that title really accurately reflects my level of nerdom. So I've certainly been studying for a really long time. And probably that's where my journey with first responders and then becoming more invested in understanding and supporting the impact that their role had on their mental health came from. So way back in the very late 90s into 2000, if you had spoken to me then, I was on a much different career path. I was very focused on becoming a clinical epidemiologist. I actually had plans to move to the United States and join the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in what they call their epidemic intelligence program, or their surveillance program. So it's kind of like the FBI, but for bugs and viruses. And so that had been my plan. And I was actually working towards doing my master's in clinical epidemiology. And as fate would have it, to get into that particular program at Monash University at the time, you had to have some kind of clinical background. And I thought, well, goodness, I'd done a psychology degree, but that didn't really fit. So I thought, I'm not going to go and do a nursing degree or something else just to get into this course. Like, how else can I navigate my way around it? And as it turned out, actually working with the 000 call centre for ambulance and giving instructions to people over the phone, they were happy to take that as clinical experience. So while I was studying, I was supporting myself by working as a 000 ambulance call taker. And so well on the way to this, wonderful, career where I thought I'd be off over to the United States and chasing bugs around the world, fate had different plans for me. And I was actually working a shift at the 000 call centre on September 11th, 2001, when the 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred.
Wow.
And I remember watching whatever footage I can or could while I was actually on shift, and then coming home and sitting in front of the TV and just watching it all unfold. And I remember thinking instinctively, even at that time, that the world as we know it has changed.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if we had all lost a little bit of our innocence in that moment. And not knowing it at that particular time, those terrorist attacks in 2001 would go on to profoundly change and impact both my professional life and my personal life.
Wow.
And so it was really by watching that unfold, I finished off my epidemiology degree, but ended up working with Monash University and actually training their paramedics. I sort of had made that shift from doing the clinical call taking over into education, and I loved it. The more I did it, the more I realised that I love what these people are doing. They're such altruistic, incredible people, and they're doing such an amazing job. One that I knew I could never actually do, because I've spent nearly 2 decades working in and amongst and with paramedics and first responders, and I've often been asked, why didn't you do it yourself? If you loved it so much, why didn't you become one? And I thought that was never my role. I never saw that as being in my future, but I knew that I was certainly drawn to what they were doing and the role that they were playing. And so I ended up doing my PhD research, looking at their role in this kind of disaster response field. And that itself opened up so many other questions for me. But really where my key interest in their mental health and wellbeing stemmed from was actually through meeting one incredible person who has now gone on to become one of my most treasured friends. Her name's Marianne Fontana. And Marianne tragically lost her firefighter husband, Dave, in the South Tower on 9/11, and went on to write an incredibly moving and emotional memoir called A Widow's Walk. And I would highly recommend anyone who really wants to get a glimpse into what disaster can do to people and those left behind. I really recommend Marianne's book.
A Widow's
And
Walk.
I just devoured it from cover to cover and cried, like not just little tears, but big, fat, ugly tears, like sobbing after reading this book. And a couple of days afterwards, I was still really impacted by her words and felt the need for the first time ever to actually reach out to her as an author, just to let her know how much impact she had had on me. And surprisingly, she actually replied within a few days and said, thanks for reading the book. She knew I was doing my PhD research. So she said, would you like to catch up? And we actually met for coffee in the little quirky firehouse directly across the road from Dave's original firehouse in Park Slope in Brooklyn. So here we are sitting right in front of Dave's firehouse, and she's telling me this story of loss, but of love. And because they had this great love, it was actually their wedding anniversary, the day he died on the terrorist attacks.
Oh my Lord.
And as we're having our conversation, and I was like, how do we support you and people that are going through what you're going through? And she was quite adamant that there's nothing you could do for us, the damage has been done. But she said, what you really need to be concerned about is those that survived and those that have been spending months digging on the pile and looking for what they call their brothers, their colleagues and victims. And she said, they're the ones that you're going to have to be worried about. And it turned out she was right.
Yeah.
But that conversation with her instigated the very first small research project I did, which was on the 5-year anniversary of the attacks. And I wanted to go back and just have a chat to a few of the responders who had been there and lived it, to see how they were reflecting on it, what their experiences of it were, but to see how it was impacting them. And what I thought would just be a small little project ended up being this incredible opportunity that ultimately changed my life, because I've since gone on to go back to that same cohort of about 60 responders and now their family every 5 years to see how they're tracking. And devastatingly, we've seen a massive decline in both their physical and mental health. And some of them are now even sadly dying of their 9/11 related illnesses, so cancers, but also 9/11 related mental health injuries. So we have sadly lost some of our responders to suicide. And it was being involved with this incredible group of people that really opened my eyes to the impact that this role has. And particularly when you respond to events on such a large and tragic scale. So I was very, very invested in looking at ways that we could support the mental health and wellbeing of our first responders, but particularly those that were involved in that large-scale disaster sort of work and mass casualty work. And that really is what led me into a lot of the subsequent teaching that I do and research that I do. I ended up having the wonderful opportunity a few years ago to do some work with the Code 9 Foundation, which was a charity set up here in Victoria by police officer Mark Thomas, who himself had gone through and lived through PTSD, excuse me, due to his service to the community. And so he had established this charity because he had felt so alone in that experience when he went through. And really what Code 9 provided was this peer support opportunity for first responders. And largely we were catering to those who had retired from the job, and many of them had been ill health retired because of their mental health. And it was trying to help them navigate life in that space. Because as you would know, there are so many unique challenges that come with retiring from a first responder role. There's so much tied up with identity and that uniform and the mateship and camaraderie. And it can be a little bit easier to manage that when you have the time and the planning and the foresight to transition through that. But when that's all forced upon you quite abruptly, and maybe it's because you've witnessed something horrific in your job or the accumulation of lots of little horrible things, but being forced out quite abruptly without being able to really plan for that is very, very impactful. And it's trying to help provide a safe space for these responders to come together and talk about and share their experiences. And that's been such a richly rewarding experience for me as a volunteer to be able to have some kind of role in that sort of space.
That's amazing. So look, I think that's an extraordinary account of how you come to do what you do. And I know that there is a difference between your kind of volunteering role and your professional job, but I love the fact that you have laid out for us these kind of pivotal points that change the whole trajectory for you, and how you have sort of described a situation where for you, you've worked out what's meaningful, where your strengths lie versus others, and you've identified this kind of gap where you can use your skills and expertise. So I wonder if you could share with us, what is the research telling us that works? And I'm particularly interested in how we think about the differentiation between what individuals can do and what the system can do. I mean, I understand not very much at all about, you know, disaster recovery, but when we are thinking in times when everything is settled and safe about how we will respond, and how well are we thinking not only about managing the disaster in a practical, logistical way, but how are we thinking about not just the physical risk that our first responders go into, but the potential for mental injury. I've probably stacked a number of things in there, but I wonder what your thoughts are around, you know, what is the research telling us, and, you know, if there is anything about that differentiation between what can be done at individual and systems level.
I think what the research is telling us now in terms of how we can best support wellbeing and mental health for our first responders is really growing, and it's showing us that to be effective, it has to be holistic in its approach. So traditionally, and unfortunately I say traditionally, but there are still examples where this is the case, and I've come across that in very recent research that I've just completed with volunteer firefighters who responded to the Black Summer bushfires recently. But traditionally, many organisations sort of had a bit of a tick box approach to supporting mental health and wellbeing. And as long as we do X, Y, Z, then we can say we've done our job, you know, fine. And many of those approaches really largely relied on the use of external EAPs, or employee assistance programs. And a really sad reflection of that was when I was speaking to some firefighters recently about their experiences after Black Summer, and we all remember how catastrophic and unprecedented that bushfire disaster was. And we spoke to 60-odd volunteer firefighters 12 months on to see how they were going and how they felt their mental health and wellbeing had been supported by their organisations. And very sad, the results showed that overwhelmingly they felt unsupported. But the majority said that all we ever received was a bulk email from our organisation saying, here's the number for the EAP, call them if you need it. Basically, that was it. And some of these people had lost their homes. They'd lost a colleague. They'd had, you know, damage. They'd witnessed horrendous, either loss of life with, you know, and a lot of them really talked about the, you know, the emotional burden of seeing the devastation on the environment and the impact on animals that were lost. And so they were profoundly impacted, but really then quite angry that the magnitude of that response hadn't been reciprocated by an appropriate magnitude of support.
It wasn't proportional, and also it was loading it onto them to do something about it. And that's, I guess, what I was trying to think about is I do feel like that even when I would give advice around here's some things to equip you and make you resilient, and some things that might buffer you against mental injury, we're putting a lot of responsibility on them.
Yes, yes.
And also what you're talking about is something that is reactive. You know, those guys are already floating way downstream and near to drowning. And what are we doing when they're upstream and they're actually well enough to, I just think, so I think that's very interesting that's
what you mentioned there, that reactive response, that's a key thing as well, and it's a key issue. And I actually interestingly wrote, it was my very first piece that I'd written for the conversation, and it was at the beginning of those Black Summer bushfires, and I spoke openly then about the need to stop placing that onus on the individual to reach out for help. We still need to encourage them to do that, but we also need to shift the responsibility to the system, to the organisation, to more appropriately and effectively reach in a more proactive way. So I think that's hugely important, and it's where many systems and organisations still are failing, in that they're set up to be reactive in their approach. They're not really being proactive in terms of reaching in to identify those who might be struggling, and potentially then being able to provide early intervention that could even mitigate some of the mental health injuries that are going on to occur, because they feel totally isolated and left alone to deal with it on their own. And so the research certainly supports that, and my own research recently has supported that we really need to encourage the individual focus, but also really push that organisational responsibility, that you have a responsibility to not only send out an EAP, because we know evidence shows us that these EAPs aren't really A, effective, and B, utilised. And the people we spoke to said, you know what, I know it's some untrained volunteer at the other end of the line who doesn't really understand the complex needs and my unique challenges as a first responder. So if they're not going to get it, why am I going to bother calling? And I know for myself, when I've experienced my own trauma, the last thing you want to do in the middle of all that, when sometimes it's hard just to get out of bed and have a shower, is to call some stranger at the end of the line and tell them your whole story. So we know the importance of building up pre-existing rapport and trust, so that when crises do occur, that people feel much more comfortable reaching out and saying, you know what, I'm struggling, I'm not really doing okay at the moment, because they trust that person. There's a pre-existing relationship there.
So what I'm hearing is that we need to have this kind of multi-faceted response that involves the individual, the organisation, and proactive and reactive. All of those things. So that's, I guess, your kind of holistic concept. But then if we're thinking about the fact that, and I agree with you, that's what I'm hearing as well, is that EAP is often not being used, and when it's being used, people are left wanting. So then, is that what leads us to thinking about the role of peer support?
Yes. Interestingly, I had a really great chat yesterday with a colleague and a friend who, and I won't name their service or their organisation, but I actually was speaking to them about the kind of support that they are provided and whether they basically were just given the EAP. And I said, look, things are getting better, but one of the problems even with the EAP is that we're only provided 3 sessions. And what good is that? Like, any of us who've actually sat down and had needed mental health support, you barely scratch the surface after those.
Like a band-aid on a broken leg.
Yeah, so people sort of look at that and go, well, why bother? Really, what help am I going to get out of that? And this person really highlighted that to them and to the people around them, the peer support was so much more important.
Yeah.
And that can come in a variety of ways. And I think organisations that are really leading the way are like Ambulance Victoria, who provide a whole host of different forms of support. So whether it's your psychologists, if that's what you prefer, or they've got their chaplaincy program, if you prefer the more religious or faith-based support, then they've got their peer support, they've got the peer dog support program, and they're even looking at more holistic approaches as well. We're starting to see the evidence around mindfulness and meditation and yoga and how all of these things are beneficial. And really, for me, any kind of effective program will include all of those or some of those bits of the jigsaw puzzle, because a one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we've known that for a long time, and the people on the ground have been telling us that for a really long time, but it just seems to be a bit of a lag in that actually coming through into practice.
And so, because we know obviously what works is that kind of top down, bottom up kind of thing, isn't it? Where we would have the coming together of people like you who are the researchers and know from the research, where we have the, you know, the organisation, the academic, and the people with lived experience, and that we're kind of listening to all of that. But then there needs to be the intent to make that happen. And where that's not happening, it feels like tokenism. And I can understand people feeling really resentful about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on lived experience, and I think that's really where we're emerging now into understanding just how important and powerful that can be. By sharing our stories, we actually empower others to understand theirs and share theirs as well. And so I think there's a real move within the wellbeing space to try to utilise these lived experience networks, whether it's small groups or larger groups or however they do that. But I think organisations now need to think in that space about, you know, and I think, again, using Ambulance Victoria as an example, it's that leadership from the top. You know, Tony Walker, as their CEO, openly talks about his mental health. He talks about how important it is to get his preventative GP checkup through his physical health, and how it's just as important that he gets his checkup from the neck up. Which I love his terminology. And you know, preventatively look after his mental health. So if you have leaders who are openly talking out about this, that's how we really normalise the conversation. That's how we actually break down the stigma that's still prevalent, particularly that 2018 national research done by Beyond Blue with the Answering the Call report that clearly showed that there's still a really big problem with self-stigmatisation. Yes. The responders aren't concerned about what other people are thinking. You know, they're not actually stigmatising each other. They're doing it to themselves. And a lot of that comes from shame and guilt and a whole host of issues that we need to tackle and address before we can really break down that self-stigmatisation that's still occurring.
And I absolutely agree. So the example of Tony Walker and Ambulance Victoria, where he is cultivating a coach culture that says it's okay to not be okay. Yeah. And in fact, I almost expect that that is something that we have to be ready for in this organisation, and we have to be, you know, like the good girl and boy scouts, we need to be prepared. We need to have the conversations before it happens. And his modelling of that is where it starts, isn't it? So that people feel held through this and not just dumped in it and having to take their own responsibility. So I like that. And I sort of have been noticing in some of the previous interviews that we've been having, and probably it's easy to do, to start giving advice to first responders about what they should do. And I do think it is really important that we also say to them, it's not all up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really key issue, Marie, because one of the things when I speak to people out there, and whether it's paramedics or police officers or firefighters or volunteers, it's like, what's that barrier? When I've actually spoken to people who I know have been traumatized and have mental health injury, what was the barrier to reaching out and asking for support? And so often, time and time again, it's that, oh, why would I talk to X or Y, you know, their manager or their leader? They don't get it, or they just don't understand, or they don't care. So there's this, you know, there's this real, I mean, many of the leaders, so, you know, we've got the Tony Walkers and you know, former Commissioner of Victoria Police, Graham Ashton, was incredible in speaking out about his need to take some time away for mental health as well. We're probably doing quite well at that really senior leadership level, the CEO exec level, but where we're running into the barrier is that sort of, you know, that middle management layer, and team members just don't feel comfortable going to their manager to talk about their mental health. They fear that it's either going to be career limiting or even potentially career ending. And I still hear that same sort of story from particularly police. If I speak up, they'll take my gun. Yeah. Firefighters, if I speak up, they'll take my uniform. They won't let me fight fires. And that's really saddening that in this day and age, when we've come so far in our understanding, that that's still not translating to real change on the ground.
And I think that many of those organisations might be quite hierarchical. Many of them, I think, still have a higher proportion of men than women. And so I wonder, you know, have you noticed that as there is more diversity inside those organisations, and perhaps, and again, this is potentially a stereotype, but how is it then for women in there? Are they able to model more communicating struggle, or do they fall into the cultural norms of the organisation they come into?
Yeah, the cultural issue is a really big one to tackle. And I constantly hear about toxic masculinity, bullying. These cultures within these organisations have traditionally been very male dominated, and there's still absolutely room for improvement there. But I think what happens too, and we've recently run an incredible pilot program funded through WorkSafe, but delivered through the Emergency Services Foundation here in Victoria. And they reached out and tailored a program specifically for those in the management and leadership positions within these organisations to really help build mental health literacy, but to then also give them practical skills and advice and tools to go back to their stations, their offices, their workplaces, their organisations, and really try to promote and develop more psychologically safe workplaces.
Yeah.
And so I think, yes, it's difficult that, you know, they are still quite dominated by males, and so the females coming in, it's hard to feel like you can make any significant or real change in that area. But I think it's really promising that most organisations are now willing to acknowledge that. And so all of these organisations across Victoria put some of their leaders and managers through. So I thought that was a really good indication that they're wanting to change. They acknowledge that this is an issue. And so many of those leaders that went through that program reported back that they found it hugely beneficial, because we provided them, instead of talking at them about mental health, you know, this is what PTSD is, we provided them with podcasts from first responders who had actually lived with it. And we talked about what it's actually like to feel these mental health injuries and live with them and work with them. And that was very powerful. And I think a lot of the leaders took a lot of lessons away from that lived experience. And then we gave them the practical skills and tools to try to have safe conversations around mental health, to recognise when people are struggling and have the confidence to approach them without feeling like they're doing the wrong thing. But I think what was a really big, conception, I guess, amongst some of these leaders was that they were a bit scared off because they thought we were trying to make them mental health professionals. And we're like, that's not your role. We don't see that as your role. You don't need to fix everybody's problems, but you need to create a psychologically safe place for people to put their hand up and say, I'm not doing okay, or I've made a mistake, or I don't feel, safe about something. If the workplace doesn't encourage those kind of safe workspaces, then we're not going to make any real change and significant change. So I think that's where we need to really focus our attention on, and not just telling them you're doing a crap job.
Yes.
Actually giving them
doing the best they can with what they've got. And so they, the mental health first aid, isn't it? That you don't need to know how to fix it, but you need to know how to recognise it and then broker, and you need to be very ready with where you're brokering that person to. And, even before that, there's that whole kind of cultural change piece around, as you say, psychologically safe. It's absolutely okay to not be okay, and you will not be disciplined or judged or shamed, and how do we sort of make that transition to a workplace that's really compassionate, and where shoulder to shoulder we're recognizing in each other the moment that someone starts to struggle. And so that support. So I was just going to say, I think you might have spoken to Greg Dean previously in one of these interviews, and I think Greg is just a shining example of how to do that well and effectively. If you speak to anybody within Victoria Police about good leadership, he will come up time and time again as an example of someone who does create those psychologically safe, workplaces. And I've sat down with him and talked to him about, well, how do you do it? What works? And I mean, a lot of it is just him. He's just that kind of person that is compassionate and empathetic and understanding. But little things, like he says, he'll have a lolly jar sitting in his office. And so it encourages people just to routinely pop past, and his door's always open. They'll come in, they'll have a lolly, and they'll have a little bit of a chat. And he builds up rapport and gets to know his staff. So that makes it that little bit easier when somebody who's usually coming in, 20 minutes early to every shift and in great, their uniform's always good and they look perfectly put together. If they start coming in routinely late and they look a bit dishevelled, and straight away that something's going on.
And he feels more comfortable in being able to approach that person to say, hey, you just don't see in yourself, is everything okay? And it can be something as simple as that. You know, a lolly jar can really open up lines of communication.
Well, he's investing in them in good times. You know, that I think Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about that idea of like we have in our relationships deposits and withdrawals, and we need to deposit enough with people. So if we need to make a withdrawal, there's enough in there, and it shouldn't be a withdrawal, but in a way it's a confronting conversation that you need to have enough in the bank for someone to be able to make it okay, so that they will open up, because otherwise it's that sort of shut down. And I think some of the research shows that when they look at who do people turn to, they don't turn to their leader, they don't turn to HR, they turn to their shoulder-to-shoulder person, which is that peer support kind of model. I also agree that it's not always a one-to-one kind of scenario that works best. And you mentioned that before, that idea of lived experience matters, and the Royal Commission on Mental Health certainly also picked that up and has expressed that for a recommendation. But also the power of groups where people get together with lived experience, and people get to hear stories that make them feel less alone, where they can feel recognised and seen in the fact that others have that shared vulnerability. So what works well for peer support then? Because I have a hunch that it could be done well, or it could fall over if it didn't have structure and purpose and some rigour.
Yeah, that's certainly been my concern as well. And you look at the range of different peer supports that are out there, and as you mentioned, they can range from individual approaches through to group approaches. They can come from the organisation, they can come externally. So I have been involved with, as I said, the Code 9 Foundation, who provide online peer support through their Facebook site. But that in itself can potentially be problematic, because if you don't have people moderating the chat 24 hours a day, then you can't control what other people are going to say. And potentially that experience can actually then, that's shared, can trigger each other. And then potentially you might even have someone coming in and saying quite dangerous things.
That's right.
But you're staffed by volunteers, so you can't have someone there 24 hours a day watching what's happening. But that does provide a very safe space for people to come in who don't necessarily feel they want to talk to someone one-on-one about their issues, but that group environment and the online environment sometimes feels very safe. The one thing that was really interesting that came out of my most recent research with the volunteer firefighters was how reliant they were on peer support when they were struggling. But the issue was they found it was much more effective when they could sit down face-to-face, whether it was a one-on-one or a small group like in a station or whatever. That face-to-face, having a cuppa or a beer or whatever and just talking things through was so important. But with COVID, the peer support workers weren't actually classified as essential workers. So in many instances, they couldn't actually go out and move around, particularly when we were in lockdown. And that came through clearly from this research, that needs to be addressed. And in future kind of events like this and public health emergencies, how vital peer support workers are, and they need to be classified within that essential service, because they felt like their mental health had certainly been impacted when they couldn't freely and easily access peer support. And I think that particularly with COVID and after the bushfires, when it was highly publicised that the government was throwing millions of dollars at mental health, and a lot of people said to me, yeah, but it's not going to where it's really needed. They need to be putting the money into activities that will actually empower local communities and individuals to assist each other. Because we all know when big disasters happen, and even day to day, as you mentioned, Marie, we're more likely to turn to those right near us, our friends, our colleagues, our peers, than we are to go to someone through our organisation. And so instead of putting all that money in at that organisational system level, like putting in all these psychologists, which in theory sounds great, if they're not actually going to utilise them, then they're not actually helping. So we need to be establishing and training up and equipping local communities to do this kind of peer support at a local level, because that's where it's going to be needed.
Yeah. And so have you seen any examples of what works particularly? And so I know that one of the things that the Australian First Responder Foundation have picked up on, and Louise's Churchill Fellowship research looked at that peer support model and also a retreat model, so that you can actually take people away from their day-to-day life and give them that real space. And so is that something that you also agree that that might be successful?
Yeah, I think approaches that give people that time and space to really reflect on the mental health and wellbeing aspect is hugely important. And I think not only for our career first responders, but perhaps even more importantly for our volunteers, because they are the ones that go out and front up to these disasters, the bushfires, the floods, the earthquakes, COVID. They're doing their role all over the place. And then they go home and they're exhausted and they've had the cumulative exposure, and then they have to go back to work, their normal job. And when do they get the time to actually have some R&R, to really just rest, reflect and recuperate? Many of them reported that throughout those Black Summer bushfires, they were doing weeks and weeks on end. They'd finally get home and then they have to go back and make up the time at their everyday job. So they never really got the time at that point to sit down and process what had happened or talk about it in a manner that worked for them. And then 12 months down the track, that all caught up with them. So I applaud Louise and the work that they're doing through the foundation, and I love the idea of the retreats and in giving people that time and space away to really just focus on their own health and well-being. It's really important.
And I think that model as well is also encompassing that holistic approach that you spoke about earlier. That was really important. That, in my conversations with Louise, what they're trying to do is to, obviously they're not going to be dealing with clinical issues in that retreat model, but to be able to sort of say, regardless of where you're at on the mental health continuum, sort of in that middle zone, that they are able to be both proactively teaching you some ways to be resilient, but also if you have moved into the experience of struggle or trauma or some responses that are happening for a mental injury, that you can get some tips and tools as well. So I know, Erin, that you have your own experience in volunteering with the Red Cross. I know that you have worked with first responders. What works for you, or how do you keep yourself mentally safe in the role that you're in? Because we know that it's not just those who are out there fighting the fires or being the ambos or whatever. It's also the people who are around them that can experience that vicarious trauma, that families, that it kind of has a bit of a contagion effect to those around. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think my experience with trauma and really understanding my own mental health was before any of the volunteering roles that actually got me out there into the community. It went back to my work with 9/11 responders, and after listening to stories, hundreds and hundreds of stories, and you almost become their secret keeper in so many ways. And I learned over time there's only so much that you can sort of push down until you can't keep it in anymore. And I ended up being quite vicariously traumatized. I would have nightmares that it was me buried under the rubble, and I would be walking down the street and a low flying plane would go overhead, and I'd sort of hunch down and look up, and it was these responses that didn't really come from my personal lived experience. It was from what I had seen and heard and witnessed from talking to so many of these other people. And so through that process of vicarious traumatization, I came to learn so much about that, because prior to that, I had never even really heard about it or considered it. It certainly wasn't something that I was protecting myself from while I was on this research journey. And I came to learn that those of us who bear witness really are at very similar risk to traumatization as those who actually experience it firsthand, and particularly those of us like researchers and journalists and psychologists and mental health professionals who hear stories over and over and over. That cumulative impact certainly builds up as well. But I was quite surprised to find out that people like myself who experience vicarious trauma, the signs and symptoms, particularly physiologically, can be quite similar to those if you were primarily traumatized. So, the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the flashbacks, the nightmares, the intrusive thoughts. I had all of that, but none of it was actually mine. It belonged to all the stories of the people I had listened to. And so I really had to sit down and unpack all that and figure out how to deal with what I was feeling. And so I worked with a mental health professional and got through all of that. And it was that work that I did that then really, I think, better prepared me for what I came across when I was volunteering. So my very first activation, for example, with the Red Cross was with the Black Summer bushfires, and it was when everyone had to evacuate out of Malakuta. And we were involved in being at the evacuation centre where everyone was coming in via those big Navy ships. So if you saw any of the media, you'll probably remember the horrific sights of basically the sky just turning dark and these people, sheltering on the beach, and then finally getting evacuated by Navy ship down to Victoria. And so by the time they came to us, and our role was to do psychological first aid and just be there to support them in whatever way we could. But the stories that we heard were terrible. But it was just the impact that I wasn't prepared for, of just seeing the impact. You could see it all over their faces. Some of them smelt like bushfire because they hadn't had a chance to escape with anything but the clothes on their back. Some of them had stories of, losing their pets, which was devastating. And so I came away from my first couple of activations with Red Cross doing psychological first aid, and I was really quite impacted. And not to go into a lot of detail, but I didn't actually think my wellbeing was really supported after that. But I was very lucky, and that was from the organisational approach, but I was very lucky that I already had these proactive and protective things in place from my vicarious trauma experience and working with my mental health professional. So I knew how to protect myself in terms of putting clear boundaries around what I could control and what I couldn't control, and the impact that I couldn't have, and how to sort of protect myself. But I worry for people who haven't had that previous experience. And largely, and this is a big passion area of mine at the moment, is really looking into, so many volunteer organisations. I mean, yes, we've got a declining rate of volunteers, so we're desperate to get people in and to build those numbers back up. But we're probably not really making sure that the people we are putting into these positions are psychologically well enough to do that.
That's right. We
don't know what their background is. And then I know I spoke to friends of mine who used to volunteer with the CFA, and in Black Saturday, some of the things that they were asked to do have impacted them and remained with them forever. And they probably weren't supported properly through their organisation. And that's a recurring theme that has come through, particularly when I talk to volunteer responders, is that if they leave, and many of them have left after big scale events like Black Saturday, like Black Summer, they're not asked why. I left the Red Cross.
No one asked me why. Yeah.
No exit interview, no one cares. So no one, well, I shouldn't say no one cares, but that's kind of how it felt in the time when you're going through it. So they're not collecting any data about why people are leaving. So we've got no idea how many people are exiting their volunteer roles because of mental health injury. We're just simply not collecting that data. And for me, that's a real problem.
And following them up to find out if they're okay, and also what you're talking about is like this this ripple effect to people around them. And I imagine that if we take a first responder who is unwilling to seek help for themselves, and they're the ones that have been out there fighting fires, imagine how difficult it would be for someone who hadn't been out fighting the fires to put their hand up. I imagine that there would be a degree of sort of almost guilt or shame or confusion about, well, God, unworthiness.
Yes.
In a way. Who am I to put my hand up and say that this was hard? I wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. And that's what happened with me. Even once I had been able to put a name on what I was feeling and why, there was still this massive amount of shame and how dare I?
Yes.
And would my talking out saying I've been traumatized, would that in some way minimize the impact of the people who actually lived it? So it's like, just, for many years afterwards, I didn't talk openly about it until I really started to understand it much more comprehensively. And now I even know, and the emerging evidence is showing us that those with vicarious trauma can even go on to have PTSD. So this is real, and it's something that we need to tackle, and it's certainly something that is becoming a much more prolific burden, not just amongst first responders, but amongst researchers, amongst journalists in the media, people that I'm talking to. And my psychologist summed it up really well when he told me one day, it's the cost of bearing witness.
Yes.
And that really resonated with me. That's a really perfect way of framing it.
And, you know, we encourage people to talk, right? That's one of the sort of first things we say is communicate, share, tell other people what's going on. But in so doing, they are passing the baton on, aren't they, in some ways? You know, I was talking with someone the other day and they said that they had been not a wife or a partner, but a flatmate of a firefighter who was young and had been on the job and had been called out. One of his first call outs was to a cot death baby. And he had come home so shocked and sat down with her and talked about it and you know, shared that experience, which we'd want him to do. But she's now a woman with teenage children, and she says she still remembers that. And when she had her children, constantly checking them. And she said she spoke to him recently, many years later, and she said, you know, when your kids were babies, were you a checker? And he was like, God, yeah. And so, you know, we see that sort of passing on of things that, you know, no one would have even thought that was a passing thing that happened through, you know, a housemate situation. But yet we've got these things that, I mean, that might not be huge in magnitude, but those things affect us.
I think there's certainly a ripple effect of trauma. And I know I certainly experienced that. So I had been vicariously traumatized from hearing the stories that I heard, but then I almost subsequently vicariously traumatized my husband. Because I would come home and share with him some of these, oh, it's heartbreaking, so-and-so said this, or such and such did this, or this person's now got cancer, or such and such just died. And I remember on my 40th birthday, actually, 5 years ago, I went back to New York with my husband and I took him to the 9/11 memorial. And it's always very overwhelming and emotional for me. And I stood there and I turned over and I looked at him and he had tears streaming down his face. And I think he had taken on so much of that impact as well from hearing through me. So I think, yeah, and it's made me much more mindful as well now with what I share and who I share it with and how I talk about it. Because yes, as you said, we encourage people to talk, but I think we need to encourage people to talk safely to the right people.
Yeah.
But then also equip those people to be able to do a good job. So again, that I go back to that, making sure we build that mental health literacy and the capacity at the leadership level, because that was a huge issue I ran into in my volunteer experience. I did speak out and I did say I was concerned about mental health and wellbeing, and I was abruptly told by someone who was quite senior, not my team leader, but someone quite senior and experienced, and basically told, suck it up. It's not the organisation's responsibility to make sure you're okay, like figure it out. And I was really taken aback and I thought, is this a generational thing? Is it something that this person's just had a lot more experience than me? And then when I step back, I thought, no, this is having, and you know, if it's impacted me and I already had a mental health, you know, professional that I could turn to and talk to, but what happens to everybody else who doesn't? And someone that they respect and admire in a senior role turns around and tells them to suck it up. What's that going to happen? What's that going to do to them speaking out again down the track?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you clamp your mouth shut, and you know, if I had $1 for every time that I've heard that, you know, that whole suck it up thing, and you know, it is that you know, masculine toxicity, and I'm not saying that it doesn't happen with women, but definitely there is a need for us to change that narrative around how we hear and listen to and respond to when people begin to share what's happening for them. But I thank you very much for sharing that vicarious trauma example, because, you know, I think it is for the Australian First Responder Foundation, it's not just about the first responder, but it's also about their families, who are the ones that often, you know, will first notice the changes. But yes, for them to be able to hear what you have said and to have an alertness around the fact that it's actually okay if they're feeling some of these symptoms of, you know, it might be exactly vicarious trauma. It might be sort of some steps earlier than that, but how important it is to have both the peer support, but also the professional support. So is there any messages, I guess, that you would like to give either from your personal or professional experience to first responders or to those people who are in leadership roles with peer responders?
So I think that a general message that targets both as well is just the importance of that sharing of lived experience. So from an individual perspective, if you have lived through something, talk about it, because if you open up about it, it's amazing how many people around you will then open up about their experience, and then that's informal peer support happening straight away. But at a leadership level, it's acknowledging how important that sharing of lived experience is, and so by leading by example and talking about experiences and normalising those conversations. But I think the really key thing we've been finding recently, and a lot of the evidence and research we've been looking at and doing, is really supporting this idea that while the individual one-on-one stuff is hugely important, we can't underestimate the power of having these small groups, and whether you call them lived experience groups or networks or peer support groups, but actually taking some time to moderate, to train up a couple of people who have that lived experience to moderate those groups. Almost in the way that the Alcohol Anonymous groups work and the Weight Watchers groups work, they're generally led by people who have lived it. And so people are more likely to trust and respond to these people. So I think for me, that's the way that we really need to look at this as well, is that, yes, it needs to be done at an organisational level, and we need to provide all those different ranges of supports, but we also need to empower them to support each other and to support themselves. And I think that's really largely through this sharing of lived experience. It's really, really important.
And to me, it's that combination and that sort of fusion between the professional expertise and the peer support, and a beautiful sort of synergy between both of those, isn't it? That, you can have, as you have, I imagine, all of the research in the world at your fingertips and all the journal articles, and you can be sort of book smart about it. But nothing replaces the wisdom of having felt all the feelings of being there and standing in the shoes of what that feels like. And it might not be the exact same experience, but our response, what is it they say, sort of a normal response to abnormal occurrences, I've heard other peer supporters talk about. So look, thank you so much for your both your professional wisdom and your personal experiences today, that I think are so profound and practical in terms of the way that not only organisations can catch them in terms of thinking about creating that culture of psychological safety, about leaders modelling that vulnerability and that it's okay to not be okay, that for first responders, thinking about that holistic model of that sort of being proactive, that being prepared, but also, when you start to struggle, how you can reactively be supported. And for, the next ripple out being the family members, the peer support responders themselves, and also then people that are involved in that sort of first line of support, that might not have other organisations looking after their needs. Your role as a researcher, or as you say, a journalist, they don't have clinical supervision. They haven't got someone looking over their shoulder. So thank you so much for all of that. I think that's been so fascinating, and I look forward to hearing more about the research that you're doing over time. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Marie.